He clung to power in Cuba for nearly half a century, but now Fidel Castro's resignation leaves the country in suspense. Just what is his legacy and what does his departure mean for Cuba? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hashim Al-Barra. Who will replace Fidel Castro? The world is waiting to see. And will they make a break with Cuba's past? 81-year-old Castro announced he's stepping down on Tuesday. On Sunday, Cuba's National Assembly will choose his successor. Fidel's brother Raúl is widely tipped to take over. He's held the reins for the last 19 months while the president's been ill. But some think Cubans will seek a new generation of leaders. And whoever is in charge, they will face renewed international pressure to move towards democracy and a free market economy. Well, when Castro was born, the average lifespan in Cuba was less than 50 years. Castro far surpassed that, spending almost 50 years in office. That makes him the longest-serving political leader in the world. For almost 50 years, he's been a fixture in international politics. A revolutionary who overthrew a dictator and went on to govern Cuba. Fidel Castro was born into a wealthy Cuban family. He was educated at Jesuit schools and went on to study law. But after receiving his degree, he turned his back on the comfortable life he had known and became a revolutionary. In 1953, Castro and his brother Raúl led an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. That brought him 15 years in jail, but after receiving amnesty, he fled to Mexico, and that's where he joined up with the famous Argentinian revolutionary Che Guevara. 3 years later, Castro returned to Cuba with Guevara. Together, they launched a guerrilla war to topple the president in 1959. Castro was sworn in as prime minister and introduced communism to the island. Thousands of Cubans fled, many to the United States, and Cuba became a Cold War battleground. Soviet leaders like Khrushchev supported Castro, but the US government launched numerous plots to get rid of him. They ranged from poisoning Castro's beloved cigars to launching attacks on the island itself. In 1961, more than 1,000 Cuban exiles, backed by Washington, invaded Cuba's Bay of Pigs. It failed. A year later, the threat of a nuclear war loomed over the whole world after the US discovered Soviet plans to station nuclear missiles on Cuba, just miles from the US coast. The Soviet Union eventually caved in and removed the weapons. At home, Castro is credited with improving Cuba's schools and crafting a renowned public health care system. Castro saw life expectancy in Cuba become one of the highest in the world. But some Cubans longed to leave their country, and in the 1990s, tens of thousands set off in ramshackle boats for American shores. Many died along the way. Castro's own health has deteriorated over the past several years. He's been noticeably weak and appears in public in a wheelchair. On occasion, he's collapsed. Due to his failing health, Castro transferred power to his younger brother Raúl in July 2006. And since then, most of the world's only seen Castro in photos or on video. The world's longest-serving leader may have retired, but he remains the figurehead for a generation of revolutionary socialists. Now joining us are our guest in San Francisco, filmmaker Saul Lando. He has directed a number of films on Cuba, including the critically acclaimed documentary Fidel. In Washington, D.C., Frank Calzone, he is the executive director of the Center for a Free Cuba. And in London, Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, he is a senior research fellow at the Center for Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us here on this discussion on the life and legacy of Fidel Castro. Mr. Saul Lando, you've been to Cuba many times. You made a documentary on Fidel. You know the man. Do you think the decision to step down is significantly important in Cuba?
Well, I think it's more symbolically important than it is realistically important. In fact, Fidel had stepped down in late July of 2006 when he went into the hospital and delegated to his brother the presidency of the island. He, at this point, said he did not aspire again to rule. This doesn't really decide whether he's going to continue on as first secretary of the Communist Party. The point, though, is that he and his younger brother, Raul, who is 76, have been political partners in every important endeavor since 1953, when they attacked Fort Moncada together. Together they went to Mexico, together they returned in a yacht called Granma, together they waged guerrilla war in the eastern mountains of Cuba, together they assumed power. Raul Castro took over the army. Later on he became the organizer of the party. He has been Fidel's very, very close junior partner for more than half a century. So I don't see major policy differences.
So Mr. Frank, in Washington, D.C., is it the end of an era, or just, as Mr. Lando has been saying, a continuation of the same system that has reigned for the last 5 decades?
Well, we Cubans, both in Cuba and outside Cuba, are always hopeful for change, but I am sorry to say that Mr. Landau explained it very well. The issue really is not whether Raul Castro is going to have the title. As long as Fidel Castro is around, as long as he has some energy, he will have an actual veto power on anything in Cuba. Furthermore, as your other guest pointed out, we don't know whether he will remain the Secretary General of the Cuban Communist Party. In the Soviet Union and other places, sometimes the president was not as important as the Secretary General of the party.
Mr. Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi, how was the response at the international level, especially in Europe, to the decision to step down?
Well, I think it has been expected for a while, and as you probably have heard, it has been welcomed in the US and in Europe. But I think the significance also is that in Cuba, which the president is retiring peacefully. This is not usual in dictatorial regimes, but I don't take it that the fact that his brother was his close associate for a long time means that there is not going to be conflict. I take it that President Castro is going to still, or Comrade Castro is going to continue to publish his column in Granma. That will be a great test for freedom of the expression in Cuba in the post-Castro period, because if he keep offending the new president, whoever he is, he might find himself maybe silenced. But realistically, I think change is coming. Change has to come.
But it may take some time.
But it's also conditional on what happened in the United States. If you have a Barack Obama presidency,
we'll definitely go back and talk about the US factor later on. Mr. Solando, now the big question is whether Mr. Raul, the brother of Fidel Castro, will be the man of change. The question is, how can somebody who has faithfully served his brother, been a staunch defender of the revolution for 50 years, be a man of change just suddenly?
Well, the question, I think, is what kind of change are people expecting? I think Cuba has begun to change. We've seen little signs of it over the last year. For example, the attitude toward homosexuals has totally changed, and the initiative here was taken by Raul Castro's daughter, who really led the nation into that. There was no objection from her father. Raul Castro's daughter also said it's ridiculous to keep hidden all of the obvious conflicts of everyday life in Cuba, like the inability of the government to pay salaries sufficient for people to live on, and the demoralizing need of people to have to buy or sell illegally in order to make do on an everyday basis. The intellectuals filed a petition with the government saying they will not accept any more censorship. That's it. They won't get another line of poetry or another line of a novel if the government decides to censor. The government did not respond except to accept the petition and say, yes, we will not censor. Very recently, a young student stood up to a very high government leader and said, why can't we travel like everybody else? And the government leader really had no good response. So this turmoil is bubbling in Cuba. I think what we're going to see, the kind of change, is more small business, more small market activities begin to open up. I don't think there will be any basic change, however, and I want to stress this, in who controls the economy.
Well, everybody has his own perception to the type of change expected from Raúl Castro. He is a man who has been credited for building the tourism industry and convincing his brother to make some concessions in the 1990s. Mr. Frank Carlson, do you think that human rights, the release of prisoners and the freedom of expression is going to be topping the agenda of Raúl in the next coming years?
Well, first of all, let's make sure we understand what it is that we're talking about. That the daughter of Raúl Castro can get away with criticizing the regime doesn't make any major difference. That one student was able courageously to ask questions. The Cuban media continues to this day to be totally controlled by the government. There's strict censorship in Cuba. There's not discussion really about substantive matters. It is true that Raúl Castro has something to do with bringing tourism to Cuba. It is also true that then he has to take responsibility for tourist apartheid. Cubans are not allowed to stay, to enter in hotels, in beaches, in clinics, in restaurants set aside for foreigners. That's very similar to what was happening in South Africa. So if we're going to give him credit for tourism, I guess we also have to point out what is happening in Cuba. Beyond that, I think the big question in everybody's mind in Cuba is what will the Cuban armed forces do? Will the Cuban armed forces, the younger military leaders that were not part of the Sierra guerrillas who fought these young officers in Africa and elsewhere, will they come to the conclusion that Cuba must find a peaceful solution? Will they say to Raúl Castro that they're not willing to shoot at Cuban protesters? Those are the big, really big questions.
He has always been a thorn in the side of the United States. When we come back, we ask, what's the U.S. policy towards Cuba after Castro? Stay with us.